Nice intimate group. I think I figured out how to get this brighter, Arthur. I think I figured out how to get it brighter. It was getting dimmer and dimmer every week. In any case, welcome. Well, I should welcome back, but we were here last week. You guys weren't here last week. Some of you were. We had a lovely, now the service has started, so now you have to listen to the rabbi. There's just a little group. They were probably the ones in fourth grade, too, who the teacher looked at. She was excellent last week. She did a lovely job. If you have a moment to see it on YouTube, she was wonderful. The young woman who celebrated her bat mitzvah last week. What was her topic was kindness. Lucy Medier, yeah. Her topic was kindness. And I wrote about in this week's, if you haven't had a chance to read it, in this week's commentary, I wrote about she celebrated it on the 100th anniversary of the first bat mitzvah, which was 100 years to the day that Judith Kaplan, I hope everybody's getting the newsletter. Yeah, you do have to scroll down a little bit, but 100 years to the day that Judith Kaplan did that. And it was a milestone in women's Jewish history, or Jewish women's history, which has culminated now in, obviously full participation women rabbis. I'm not sure the mic is working. The mic is working. Okay, well now I can hear you. The mic is working. I might have been speaking a little bit too low. All right, we are going to start now because we're going to read about Shabbat candles and get going. Our readers tonight are Sandy Altman, Melanie Goldberg, Susie Friedman, Audrey Pleasant, Fred Pius, and Rabbi Miriam Jairus. We'll begin on the next slide. As these Shabbat candles that we are about to light give light to all who behold them, so may we by our lives give light to all who behold us. As their brightness reminds us of the generations who have kindled light, so may we in our own day be among those who kindle light. I'd like to invite Helen and Saul Foreman to light our candles tonight.
Shabbat Shalom. Let us endeavor to find still moments, quiet spaces within to refresh ourselves, moments without ceaseless questions or inner debates, when we meditate only on goodness. Let us endeavor to nurture courage, recalling moments of strength. Let us remember days of fortitude and the power that we found. Let us endeavor to feel the warmth of a loving touch, our faces and fingers outstretched, alive to each other.
Sing May all who walk the paths of righteousness, who work for the good of humanity, and bear the burdens of others, and who give bread to the hungry, who clothe the naked, and take the friendless into their homes, see the work of their hands endure, and may the seed they sow bring abundant harvest.
Neil deGrasse Tyson wrote, "We are all connected to each other biologically, to each other chemically, to the rest of the universe atomically. There's as many atoms in a single molecule of your DNA as there are stars in the typical galaxy. We are, each of us, a little universe." Carl Sagan put it this way, "The cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way of cosmos to know itself."
We live in two worlds, the one that is and the one that might be. Nothing is ordained for us, neither delight nor defeat, neither peace nor war. Life flows, and we must freely choose. We can, if we will, change the world that is into the world that may come to be. Our ancestors expressed this in words that have come down to us through the millennia.
Keep your tongue
From evil
and your lips from deceitful speech.
Depart from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it.
Let justice dwell in the wilderness, righteousness in the fruitful field.
And make that justice roll down as waters, righteousness as a mighty stream.
Sing the song of people, joined in understanding and respect. The song of life's wonders, an earth protected and cherished, a gift for our children and the generations to come. The song of a land once ravished by war, now quiet and content. Her soldiers home to leave no more. The song of a world redeemed, the song of peace.
In this community where we find strength and common purpose, we turn our minds and hearts toward all those who need our love and our support. Those who are ill, those who suffer pain of the body or spirit, those who are lonely, those who have been wronged. Tonight our well wishes are extended to Joe Gaydon and to Rabbi Peter Schweitzer and to anybody whom you happen to be thinking about as we go around the room, starting over here. Anybody? Anybody on this side here? Anybody else? We extend our wishes too, having just sung about making a world of peace, to all those who are suffering in Ukraine. May they know peace soon. And may all who suffer know that they are not alone. May they be healed quickly. May they experience a refuah shlema, complete recovery, the renewal of their bodies, and the renewal of their spirits.
Core, in memoriam. When I'm struggling with the fear of my own death, or with grief over the death of someone I love, what comforts me most isn't philosophies or ideas. It's the presence of someone who loves me, just sitting with me silently, letting me feel what I have to feel, not trying to fix it or make it go away, but simply being with me while I feel it. It's the presence of someone who loves me, letting me know that I'm not alone, and by their presence,
being part of the foundation I can come back to when the feelings pass.
Our thoughts turn to those who are no longer with us, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every people and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, of life and death, recalling now our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and those whom we have taken into our hearts with our own. Tonight we observe the yard sites of Rose Berger, Bertha Ernstein, David Fleischer, Jermaine Ash Friedman, Larry Gordon, Dorothy G. Grauer, Larry Hirsch, Jack Kadish, Sophie Lieberman, Alfred Lubeck, Esther Luria, Sam Meyerson, Boyd Musser, Albert Paul, Morris Plafkin, David Remnick, Jack Rose, Carl Rossman, Harold Schiff, Martin Shore, George William Trapp, James Walker, Leon Williams, and Irene Young. And if there's someone who has died whom you're thinking about tonight and would like to share their name, once again, we'll go around the room. Anybody on this side? Go ahead. Madeline Albright of blessed memory, yes. Tom?
Mike Phelps.
No, his brother. No, Mike, yes, Mike, and his brother, sorry, yes. Anybody on this side? Yehi zichram livracha, may memories of these beloved people provide them with a sense of comfort as they go through life in their absence. If you can do so comfortably, please rise for a humanistic interpretation of Kaddish. For a moment I was remembering maybe Mike wasn't dead. But yeah, it was one of the many people, several people we lost to COVID. If you can do so, please, I'm sorry, I already said that. I got a little shaken there by thinking about him. Lovely man. Let's read together. Nit Gadal v'nit Kadash beruach ha'adam. Let us dignify and ennoble all people in the spirit of our shared humanity. Let us acclaim the preciousness of life. Let us show gratitude for life by approaching it with reverence. Let us embrace the whole world, even as we wrestle with its parts. Let us each in our own way take up our share in serving the world and seeking truth. May our commitment to life help us to strengthen healing of spirit and peace of mind. May justice and peace permeate and comfort the house of Israel and all those who dwell on earth. And let us say, Ken Yehi, may it be so. Please be seated. Tonight, it is my privilege to welcome to our bima Dr. Fran Shor. He is Emeritus Professor of History at Wayne State University, where throughout his distinguished career, he taught courses and conducted research in the fields of historical and cultural studies. Fran is the author of several nonfiction books, including the latest that we'll be hearing about in just a few moments. He's also written a novel, Passages of Rebellion. From scholarly journals to popular online sites, he's also published works covering a broad range of topics in 20th century U.S. and global history. In addition to his academic work, he has been a longtime peace and justice activist, serving previously on the boards of Peace Action and the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights. For the past several years, he has been an active member of our congregation, and we are very grateful for that. He's provided us with his expertise and leadership in social justice work and other areas, serves on our Board of Trustees, co-chairs our Engagement Committee, and facilitates a number of programs, most notably our book and film and television groups. Maybe they'll even be in person someday again. We can only hope. I'm personally very grateful for his membership, his belonging to this community, and all of his support in that regard, and above all, proud to call him a friend and a mentor and an inspiration. So please join me in welcoming our friend, Dr. Fran Shor.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about my most recent book and to address you all, some of whom were actually instrumental in giving me stories from your own past about your interaction with Soupy Sales, particularly when he was here in Detroit from 1953 to 1960 on WXYZ TV in Detroit. By the way, I almost didn't make it here tonight. Well, I have this awful car. It's called a Rolls Canardly. It rolls down one hill and Canardly make it up the next. That is a Soupy Sales joke that I remember from when I first watched him as a gangly, geeky, young teenager in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I didn't grow up in Detroit. I grew up in Pittsburgh. And, you know, he struck me with such an air of whimsy, such an air of subversive behavior that I thought, this is a guy I gotta follow. And of course, I sort of tucked that away as I left my childhood years. But the reason I came back to this book was a combination of a series of events. I think one of them was finally convincing my father that he needed to be moved up here when he was 98 so that we could look after him, and he needed to be in a memory care unit up here. So there was that, and I had just finished writing about white supremacy and racism and a lot of other heavy themes, and I needed to find some kind of relief. So rummaging in my memory, I went back to some of those crazy days of watching Soupy Sales and going through the hallways of my junior high school, waving to other friends and going, "Lil, Lil, Lil." And everybody who knows nothing about Soupy Sales, then or now, would look at me rather strangely, wondering, has this guy gone off his rocker? And I may have gone off of some of the rocker. In any case, what I wanted to do tonight is to provide you with a little bit of the history of Soupy Sales, in particular his Jewish background and Jewish connections. In addition, of course, I'm going to focus a little bit more on that Detroit period, because the book focuses almost exclusively in those chapters about Soupy Sales in Detroit. So let's start a little bit with his family history. For the next slide, please. Keep going. One more. All right. Okay. So in this really grainy Kodachrome, probably, there's a picture of Soupy in his mother's arms. His mother, who was Selma Sadie Berman, was born in 1897 in Baltimore to Jewish immigrants from Russia, Etta and Max Berman. His father, who's not pictured here, was born in Hungary in 1890, arrived in the U.S., settling in Baltimore, where he met Soupy's mom. He came in with these waves of Eastern European Jews, including my grandparents and some of your family, of course, from places like Lithuania, Ukraine, and Romania. Now, Soupy doesn't reveal a lot in his one memoir about his family history. In fact, I had to do a little bit of digging in order to find out the genealogy of this family. It wasn't too difficult, you know, going on the web to be able to locate that. But one of the things that Soupy says is the reason that he was born where he was, which was, believe it or not, in a little town called Franklintown, North Carolina. He was born in January 8th, 1926. This is about when he's a little less than a year old here. And he has two older brothers. Leonard, who was born in 1918, who went on to become an optometrist and actually died in 1998. And the brother Jack, born in 1920, the younger one, they're born in Franklintown, North Carolina, who died in Lancaster, Ohio, and he was a lawyer. According to Soupy in some of his memoirs, he was born there because he wanted to be close to his mother. And Soupy got his name and went through, he was born as Milton Suppman. His father's name was Irving Suppman. And his brother, Leonard, according to Soupy, was called Hambone, obviously not keeping kosher in that family. His brother Jack was called Chicken Bone, and this left for the young Soupy, or Milton, the name of Soup Man, which later became Soupy Suppman. That was how he was known right up through his time when he began in Cincinnati in 1949 in early television, when his name got changed to Soupy Hines, Hines. And when he came to Detroit, he still had that name until they changed it to Soupy Sales. So one of the things that also Milton Suppman did is that he engaged in what I call comedic confabulation. By that I mean he stretches the truth a lot in order to please and get a laugh from an audience. So for example, his parents, the only Jewish family in Franklintown, North Carolina, by the way, a town of some 1,200, 1,300 people. So they obviously stood out like sore thumbs, so to speak. But they also had a dry goods store. Now, according to Soupy, they were so revered in the community that even the Ku Klux Klan bought their sheets from his parents. Confabulation? Yes. In fact, I had to go back and research the Ku Klux Klan and what it was in North Carolina. And of course, the Klan during the 20s was enormous. In fact, they almost elected a mayor here in Detroit in 1926. So yes, so it was enormous. But at that time in North Carolina, apparently there weren't any Klan operatives in Franklintown, and more significantly, if you were a member of the Klan, you had to buy your sheets from the Klan store. You couldn't go outside the Klan store. Yeah, so this is a little bit of that confabulation. So Milt Irving dies in 1931 when Soupy is just 5 years old, and it's very shattering for him at that time. When his mother remarries, marries a guy by the name of Felix Goldstein, they moved to Huntington, West Virginia. Now, Huntington, West Virginia had a Jewish population equal to the whole size of Franklintown, like 1,200, 1,300. They had a couple of Jewish congregations, and I never could find out. In fact, I don't think they were ever affiliated, Soupy's family. Although, again, his parents, both his father, who died when Soupy was young, and his mother, who died much later in life, were buried back in a Jewish cemetery in Baltimore. Next picture, please. All right, here is, and maybe I also had an affinity for Soupy because he had that same kind of geeky-looking face that, I had in my high school picture. We had flat tops then, but, So this is the high school picture from Huntington, West Virginia, when he graduated in 1943. He talks about himself as the class cut-up. And he, as a class cut-up, one of the things that he particularly found fascinating about some of the early films that he watched were the physical comedy of the Marx Brothers in particular. And he also was a big fan of swing music, and that would become part and parcel of his evening show here in Detroit called Soupy Sales, when he would feature these very prominent jazz performers who would come into Detroit playing these scores of venues were in and around the city of Detroit during the 1950s. Soupy also played clarinet when he was growing up, and he was a big fan of one of the lesser-known clarinet big band leaders, a guy by the name of Jerry Wald. I don't know if anybody have heard that. I mean, the two big ones, obviously, were Benny Goodman and Woody Herman. Yeah, I'll never forget. That's right. Next picture, please. Soupy joins the Navy. He enters Marshall College, which is now Marshall University, in Huntington, West Virginia, but immediately drops out to join the Navy, actually at 17, where he becomes a seaman first class on the USS Randall. That was an attack transport ship that launched from San Diego in 1944. And here's Soupy probably in one of the San Diego clubs. Can anybody recognize who that is on the right? Nat King Cole. Absolutely. Nat King Cole, sitting down with Nat King Cole. And one of the things that I think is very important, and maybe I make a little bit too much of it, and maybe over-determine my analysis here, but Soupy was actually one of the first people to feature jazz performers and do it in a way which was very deferential, very knowledgeable about them. I mean, he gave a platform for African-American artists on early television. And, you know, it's often pointed out that people like Steve Allen, who had an evening, the original Tonight Show, that he was the one who really introduced these great jazz performers. But actually, Soupy scooped them in that sense. So here he is on the ship. Now, he begins his career, in a sense, on the intercom of this ship, where he's, believe it or not, a chaplain's assistant. He was not a good chaplain's assistant. He didn't convert anybody. But he told a bunch of jokes on the intercom system, and he claims that it's where he first invented the character who would become one of my favorite characters, and maybe one of yours, White Fang. Yes. So White Fang actually comes from the sounds of White Fang. The name comes from the Jack London novel, which Soupy was familiar with, but the sounds are actually emanate from what was then a V-disc that he used to entertain people of the Hound of the Baskervilles, where you would hear some of that music. So there, and he talks a little bit. You know, there are a whole series of stories and traumas that he actually, as you would expect, being in the Pacific, that he would encounter on the ship. But of course, when he was being interviewed for his memoirs, because it was done with a co-writer, actually the guy who authored the text, a guy who I was in contact with, a man by the name of Charles Salzberg. Soupy wasn't in good shape. It was 2001. He'd die 8 years later, but he was already in sort of failing health. So sometimes he couldn't remember things, but it's often hard for us to have that kind of recall. In fact, Soupy includes in one of his books of jokes a story about an elephant and a hyena visiting a water hole. And the elephant and the hyena make their way over there, and the elephant spots a tortoise, and he looks at it, and he brings his foot back, and he kicks the tortoise a mile in the air. And the hyena's like, well, why did you do that? So that tortoise bit my toe years ago. And he said, how could you remember that? He said, I have turtle recall. Okay, so on with the show. Next. All right. So here's Soupy on TV beginning his absurdist programming with a program called Club Nothing, but he actually also began a dance show preceding Dick Clark, who a dance show for teenagers on WHTN in Cincinnati, but of course featuring mostly big band music at the time, and doing sketch comedy. And some, because I had to check on his time frame and the specifics, I had to go back and look at newspaper archives. So I'm looking at Cincinnati papers, Cleveland papers, as you'll see later, and Detroit papers. And because I didn't grow up in Detroit, I also had to rely on, friends, family, extensive interviewing that I was able to do, and happy to hear all of that. Next picture. Soupy didn't last too long at that particular station because, as he claims, it was owned by used car salespeople who didn't really appreciate his humor. But he's in Cleveland, both on radio, WJW radio from 1951 to 53, what was known from 6 to 9. He was a DJ, which was often now referred to as the morning drive. And he also had an afternoon show from 4:30 to 5, followed at one point by somebody whose name may be familiar to you, Alan Freed, who is claimed to be the person who developed the idea of rock and roll. Now, rock and roll had an old R&B past. It had been used within the black community. But it was Alan Freed, known as Moondog in that Cleveland station, who would push the early R&B and early rock and roll. And actually, this is a photograph, one of his headshots of a souvenir that he gave to one of his fans in Cleveland. And actually, it's in Cleveland where he gets the first pie in the face. Now, later on, of course, Soupy is known and claims that he was hit by at least 10,000 pies over his history. And he's very famous for getting hit in the face with pies. The first one started in Cleveland, where they did this sort of cockamamie routine, taking off on the film that came out at the time of Cochise, which actually was a film that starred, it's called Broken Arrow. Broken Arrow, some of you may remember that. And it did feature Jay Silverheels, who went on to play Tonto in the television Lone Ranger. And remember, Lone Ranger actually started here in Detroit, WXYZ radio. In this sequence, Soupy is supposedly riding on a horse. He falls off, and in terrible and stereotypical ways in which Native people were supposed to be talking at the time, what he says is, "White men come here, steal our land, steal our buffalo, kill our buffalo. What does white man leave?" And me, boom, he gets hit in the face with a pie. And I made a sort of an aside in the book and said, if only the interaction between the white empire and Native peoples was with pies in the face, it would be a lot better situation for us all. But next one. All right. So you're going to recognize both of these people because they were the preeminent Jewish comedians on early television, from which Soupy stole a lot of stuff. Milton Berle, by the way, and some of you may remember the old Texaco Theater show. It was tremendously popular in the limited number of stations. Remember, there aren't a lot of television stations at the time. There aren't even a lot of television sets during this early 50s period. But Milton Berle dominated the airwaves to such an extent, even in Detroit, that it said that after his show was over, the Texaco Comedy Hour, after that was over, the water pressure in Detroit would dip because everybody would have been heading off to the bathroom, which reminds me of another Soupy's joke. So Soupy often had, for those of you who remember in the clubhouse, during the lunch with Soupy Sales days, he would have a blackboard, and it would either be words of wisdom or Soupy Says. So thinking about this idea of what happens in the Detroit after Milton Berle show, Soupy had in one of his Soupy Says was, show me a royal castle. No, show me a castle with a toilet, and I'll show you a royal flush. That was one of the Soupy Says. Now, for those of us who love wordplay, that was to me just a great and wonderful thing. Now, Milton Berle, those of you who remember, never got hit in the face with a pie, but what used to happen is he would yell out, makeup, or somebody would yell out makeup, and they'd come with a big powder puff, and they'd hit him in the head. Or, alternatively, somebody would come out and squirt him with a bottle of seltzer. You may remember that also. Soupy on the clubhouse used to have a little peg underneath that said, do not touch. And every time he opened it up, he'd get squirted in the face. I'm not sure whether it was seltzer water. It was never Mrs. Fox, you betcha, chocolate syrup, because then you can make an egg cream out of it with the seltzer water. Now Sid Caesar, do you remember, any of you remember this kind of character that he played? Yeah, it's Carl Reiner, and this is the character that, well, no, he actually did a series of experts, right? Usually with German Yiddish influences. Both Milton Berle and Sid Caesar were Borscht Belt comedians. And as, you know, Soupy did not play the Borscht Belt, did not play the place in those places in upstate New York. But these were a various series of professors, all of whom I liken to the wise men of Helm, because of what mishegas they often involved themselves in, and what kind of Luftmensch they often were, right? So, for example, in one sequence where he plays Ludwig von Fossel, this is Sid Caesar, he talks about trying to straighten out the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And his idea was that you get a large caravan of camels, tying a rope to their humps, and then you're going to straighten it out. And of course, when Carl Reiner, the interlocutor, asked him, well, what happened, Professor Ludwig von Fossel? Well, we didn't move any of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but all the humps of the camels had been flattened. So a lot of these sketches that Sid Caesar did were sketches that Soupy would use as sort of templates for the evening program that he called, when he came to Detroit, Soupy's On. Usually ran from 11 o'clock in the evening, first to 11:15, and then from 11 to 11:30. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. Next slide, please. Well, here we are with Soupy Sales in the Motor City. You recognize the old Kern block, and those of you who grew up here, again, I didn't grow up, but that's a wonderful picture of the 50s. Remember, Detroit at this time, in 1950, was considered the fourth or fifth largest city in the United States, 1.8 million people. Marty, well, I'm getting to that. You're trying to steal my thunder, Mullet. Okay, so, yeah, you know, for Soupy, Detroit became a mecca. But as I discuss in my book, for many African Americans, even though they finally made it into the auto industry, it was a mirage because of all the racial discrimination that's still continued in this town, particularly in housing and employment. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are the development of the Jewish neighborhoods, and all of you will, you know, who grew up, had family that on on the east side here. My wife's Bubby was on Mac and Montclair. Mac and Montclair was on this side, right on this side. And then, of course, you know, you're talking about people who went to Central High School, right, in this area. But by 1953, when Soupy comes to town, and maybe the Detroit Jewish population, about 2% of the total population, about maybe 80,000 or so, most of that is there in this northwest area. About 80% of Jews in this period still live in the city of Detroit. And Soupy moves into a duplex first on Schaefer, then in a series of houses in northwest Detroit, until, believe it or not, in 1958, because he becomes one of the best paid celebrities in town, $100,000, which is like amazing amount of money at that time, right? He moves to, guess where? Grosse Pointe. They let him in. No bagels next to his name. Yeah. But during this time, when he was still in the northwest area, let's show the next slide, please. Some of you may remember the Fancy Schmancy Deli, right? That's 7 Mile in Wyoming. So according to one of my interviewees, Soupy used to sit at this door, right by the door, the first booth, as you come into Darby's. He'd sit there and he'd greet everybody. Now, the problem, it's hard for me to try to nail down all of the stories that I heard about sightings of Soupy in the Northwest. It's almost equivalent to the sightings of Elvis, but the difference is it was after Elvis passed, and this is when Soupy's still alive, that you get to see all these sightings. But because he still had a connection to the Jewish community, and because he was a war veteran, he would be emceeing lots of Jewish war vet events. He also was at children's parties sponsored by Temple Israel. And then even when he had moved out of the Jewish neighborhoods, he and Rube Weiss, who was well known as a radio personality and was also on the evening program, Shoutin' Shorty Hogan. He was Santa Claus. He played Santa Claus. There was an ecumenical way of playing Santa Claus. So yeah, and even he and Rube Weiss were speakers at the JCC when it was still in Northwest Detroit, right? And what makes it funny. Next slide. Here's the Marty. Here's the long shot, and here's the Maccabees building. There's the Detroit Institute of Arts. And so this is looking down, of course, Woodward. And here's where the WXYZ studios were for the longest time, on the 13th and 14th floor of WXYZ. So, next slide, please. Okay, so here's, of course, one of the favorites. Elaine, who is this? No, Pookie. It is Pookie. Right. So originally, when Soupy came to Detroit in 1953 and started at the station WXYZ TV, he didn't have a first name. He didn't have a last name. He was just Soupy. And the noon hour every day was when Soupy would appear with these cast of puppets and with silent movies where he made up these ridiculous puns, which is what I immediately gravitated to, like that Rolls Canardly. And a lot of the advertising for this program of the 12 o'clock comics, as it was called, was in the women's page, right? Because the demographic was, we're going to aim to get mothers who are at home, right, to really have their kids when they come home from school, because remember, schools were in the neighborhoods close by, you had much longer for lunch, and most kids came home for lunch. And then had their lunch with Soupy Sales. And he'd often tell people what, the next day, what he was going to have. I'm going to have a grilled cheese sandwich. But he would often then hold up. So he poured a pitcher of milk, and you'd hear in the background a mooing sound. He would he'd pick up Jell-O, and Jell-O was a main sponsor when he went national in 1959, the first time I saw him, right? He'd pick up the Jell-O and wiggle it, and you would hear this boinging sound. So everything had a shtick connected to it. And this, of course, is Pookie, who was first essentially silent, but would do mimicking to, or pantomiming to songs. Sometimes the Stan Freberg satires, right? The Yellow Rose of Texas, or The Great Pretender, any of those sorts of things. Next slide, please. Okay. Here is White Fang. Now, that other guy is Clyde Adler. Clyde Adler was the primary puppeteer for White Fang and Blacktooth. White Fang, the meanest dog in the world, or in Detroit, and Blacktooth, the nicest dog, and would often grab, you see the paw come out, grab Soupy off camera with a big kiss and throw him back. And this was his regular getup, right? Black sweater, big polka dot pie, and a kind of cockamamie hat too that you would see on the Sid Caesar professor character, or even Clem Cadiddlehopper, Red Skeleton character. Now, one of the things that I argued in the book is that White Fang often was, they were a duo, right? White Fang and Soupy, and Soupy would always have to translate the guttural sounds of White Fang, because nobody could know what the hell, they don't know until he's told. Soupy tells what it is that White Fang said. And often what happens is, in some ways, White Fang, or Soupy crosses White Fang gets mad and throws a pie at him. And it's often what I say, that White Fang is the schlemiel and Soupy is the schlemazel. For those of you who don't know, it's the schlemiel who spills the soup, schlemiel spills the soup, schlemazel who gets the soups spilled on. Yeah, so that's the Yiddish connection between Soupy and White Fang. Next slide, please. So this is the evening program, and as I said, the evening program was like night and day, literally. Soupy would be in a beautiful suit, and you could see here, some of you can see this, Big Boy. Yes, Big Boy was one of the sponsors, local sponsors, and often Soupy would announce, next day I'm going to be in a Big Boy in such and such a neighborhood, and hundreds of people would show up. That was an indication of how popular he was. Another sponsor at the time was, some of you may remember, Altus Beer, which became the sponsor also for the Lions and Tigers. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, so, by the way, Clyde Adler passed. He was actually such a good puppeteer that he was asked by the founder of the Muppets to become a performer with the Muppets. Oh, sorry. Yeah. All right. So on the right is the house band on the Soupy's On program. That guitarist in front would go on to become even more famous as the guitarist for the Funk Brothers, a guy by the name of Joe Messina, who I was delighted to interview. Joe gave me all kinds of stories about what had happened in that evening program. And so, as did Jane Adler, Clyde's widow. And Soupy would often tease Joe, say something like, if you keep picking at that, it'll never heal. So here's the cast then from his sketch comedy crew. Leon McNew, Jane Hamilton, Clyde Adler, Bertha Foreman, Soupy, and Rube Weiss is missing. And there were a whole series of skits that were done, advertised also in the Free Press and the news. Among those, The Lone Rider, Wyatt Burp, Charles Vichyssoise. Just a really crazy bunch of characters. Unfortunately, all of these programs, both the evening programs and the afternoon programs, the morning programs, were destroyed because they were on Kinescope. And so to try to reconstruct what some of these were, there's one or two that remained that I was able to get hold of, and there are also, I was able to get a couple of the actual sketches that had been kept in some people's memorabilia. And so that allowed me to go back and look at some of these sketches. Next slide, please. And again, as I said, there wasn't a single solitary, well-known jazz performer at the time that Soupy wasn't able to get on the evening program. And all around town, you probably remember these, not just Baker's keyboard, which they had a contract with Baker's actually, and people appearing at Baker's had to appear on the Soupy show. And of course, people like Miles Davis was on the Soupy show at least 6 different times. Joe Messina told me that after Miles made one appearance, and maybe he was still trying to kick his habit, the accordionist said to him, "Does that guy need to take music lessons?" It's like, excuse me. This is Illinois Jacquet, a famous jazz tenor sax player, but just an incredible number of performers, Charlie Parker, Billie Holiday, on and on and on, of just jazz greats. And for the most part, they would appear solo, artists with the house band performing. Sometimes the house band wasn't as hip as Joe Messina was to these songs that the performers would play, like Charlie Parker's Groovin' High. So they didn't, like Hal Gordon didn't know how to play the chords for Groovin' High, but the chord structure of Groovin' High was actually based upon an old ballad, Whispering. So Joe said, just play the chord for Whispering and you'll get it down. As I said, Soupy went on to decided that for both personal reasons and professional reasons, he wanted to go to a bigger market. And he went in 1961 to LA, was on the air out there for about a year and a half or so. Then from there went to New York, and in New York he had a new Soupy Sales show. If you see any of the Soupy Sales shows that are on the web, and there's some that's on this thing called Jewish Life TV, those are practically all from the New York period in the mid 1960s. And actually then also he later on was part of the radio programs, that he had his own radio program sandwiched in between Howard Stern and Don Imus. That was a really amazing, kind of situation. But Soupy never really left Detroit. Next photograph, please. Next slide. And every year, particularly during the 70s, Soupy would come back and he'd perform at this telethon, a yearly telethon, which raised money mostly for children with cognitive impairments. This was usually held on the Light Guard Armory, as it was called, right on 8 Mile, and featuring the Johnny Trudell Orchestra, although my friend Bill Meyer, who is a well-known local jazz pianist, also played on that telethon late in the night, and said Soupy would do his jazz comedy. It was just like riffing constantly. And some of you did tell me stories when Soupy would come back and appear at the Holly Club or places around that, where his comedy would turn a little blue. Not that he ever did it on the air, but last slide, please. And this is a great drawing by an incredible caricaturist by the name of Drew Friedman, whose books on Jewish comedians and more Jewish comedians have these wonderful caricatures. And here's Soupy, who was a longtime member of the Friars Club when he was in New York with the pie. And this is part of Soupy's passing in October of 2009 in New York and buried in New York. That's me. And now for the shameless promotion. I do have copies of this book at a super discounted cost of $20. So anybody who's really interested in buying, I can sign a copy. And again, thanks to you and thanks to Jeff. I know there are questions. I want to hear your stories. Natan, you also, and then Tom.
I just want to ask you, though, the story going around must have been the late 60s when I was in college, when he's already been long gone from Detroit, but there was a storyline that he lost his, I think, L.A. job when he told the kids.
No.
You know what I'm
All right. So here's the story. Here's the story. No, the story is true, and it's probably the most infamous incident. On January 1st, 1965, when Soupy was in New York City on the air, on television, had his regular program, he was hoping that the station, managers would give him the day off. They refused to. So he was a little perturbed as it was. And when they came to the end of the program, the stage manager was telling him, you've got to stretch it because we have some more time. So Soupy, in his inimitable style, said, "Kids," because he always looked right directly into the camera, trying to break sort of the fourth wall, so to speak. "Kids, now I want you to be very quiet because I know your mom and dad were up very late in the evening, but I want you to go into their bedroom, into your dad's pocket or mother's purse, and find those green pieces of paper with those funny bearded gentlemen on them. Take those, put it in an envelope, and send it to Soupy Sales, care of such and such, and I'll send you a postcard from Puerto Rico." Well, the station managers and the bigwigs blew up. Soupy, there are many stories about whether he got any money and whether it was more than just monopoly money. But anyhow, they suspended him. After, though, a day or so, when kids noticed that he had been suspended, they began picketing the station. Hundreds came out and picketed the station. And finally, the management relented and said, we got to get him back on the air. But that's one of the true stories. Yes, Tom, you had a comment or question.
What about marriages and children?
Okay, right. So he married a woman by the name of Barbara Fox in Huntington, West Virginia, somebody who he knew from school. And she came with him to Detroit. First, they had gone to Cincinnati and then to Cleveland. And by the time he got here in 1953, there was one son, the older son, Tony, and then a younger son who was born here, Hunt. So he had two children, both of whom became rock and roll musicians and actually performed with David Bowie. I tried getting a hold of them. I tried to contact them. His first wife is not around anymore. His second wife, Trudy, is still around and lives in New York City. And I had to go through a couple of people to, get some feedback from her, but not a lot. So it was just impossible to get them, even though I tried through various intermediaries who are part of the rock industry, and I just couldn't get a hold of them. But there are a number of interviews with both Tony and Hunt, some of whom appear in that book of memoirs, and some appear later on after his passing. Other questions? Yes, Rabbi.
Little confession, but when I was a kid, my parents got me a little doll, Soupy Sales, and I slept with it for years.
Whoa!
In my basement. But I'll be honest with you, I didn't know who he was.
That's right.
So I guess they went on vacation or something like that. The kids, I'm born in '62, the kids my age, we never heard of him.
Right.
We knew he was like somebody our parents liked, or somebody our grandparents were vaguely aware of. What happened to his career?
Okay. Well, no, he goes to L.A. He has an evening program in L.A. at 7:30 in the evening, and it's such a successful show primarily because all the celebrities wanted to come on the show and get pied. Frank Sinatra was the first, and then Burt Lancaster, Tony Curtis, and as Soupy says in his memoirs, one of the only celebrities who refused to pie was a young woman by the name of Lassie, a young female by the name of Lassie. The Soupy Shuffle, right. He did the Soupy Shuffle. That was it. So after he left L.A. and went to New York, he had this really famous program on New York TV. And some of my friends who grew up in New York City said, well, why didn't you include the whole discussion of New York? Because, he was there. After finishing up in New York in the late 60s, he always had some problems once he left Detroit with a lot of management, of these television stations. He got along with the people here in Detroit. But he became a permanent on What's My Line? That's where you would have seen him probably in the 70s or 80s, and a number of other game shows where he became, sort of a well-known regular in those game shows. Marty.
And you think as an historian, thinking about this, that, from 53 to 60, I was basically from 7 to 14. After 1960, in that period, there was a lot of business. The whole the country. By 1964, we had the Kennedy assassination. I was the type of humor that kids would buy into. I wonder if that led to maybe that his type of shtick wasn't as, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that some people make a case for the fact, as I do too, that because Soupy's humor was so off the wall, and when you compare it to the other major children's program at the time, the Mickey Mouse Club, it's like, yeah, I mean, excuse the expression, but it's a difference between Jewish humor and Goyish and not so humor. Choose the expression. And what happened was, I think those of us who picked up on this kind of anarchy almost, of this kind of Dada-esque quality to Soupy's humor, also paid a lot of attention to Mad Magazine. I was a big fan, as some of you might have been, to Mad Magazine. And I think what it did, it established a certain kind of anti-authoritarianism that carried us through as protesters in the 1960s. I'm not making a claim that, Soupy was in no way political in that sense. But just by the kind of style and shtick that would go on his programs. But you're right. I mean, by a certain point, it's hard that that kind of humor, while it might have been really something that resonated with us when we were younger, by the time we're heading into the 60s and all this severe news is coming on about what's going on with civil rights and what's going on with wars, that was obviously very, very sobering, but we still had that crazy sensibility when it came to that humor. Tom?
Yeah, one more question.
Sure.
And it makes me laugh and smile. In the studio, there was that door.
Yes,
And knock on
you're
the
right.
door, he would open up and just fall on the crowd.
Right, I talk about that a lot more in the book. It's usually the next door neighbor, some kind of, the angry man is sometimes referred to. There would always be, there'd be a little shtick. He'd order something and it would be a delivery man and he'd give the guy a buck and he'd say, wait a second, where's my change? And the guy would hand him what was half of a deer, half a buck. Now, as I talk about that humor, I use some references to child psychologists to talk about what at particular developmental stages of childhood, what strikes people's humor, right? I mean, the slapstick stuff is a very primitive part of the brain, but wordplay becomes a more mature part of the brain, and so I talk a little bit about that. But also, he sometimes gets pied from the door also, and the neighbor's always irate about something. Your dog is in my shrubney. That's one of the lines, Yes.
True story. It's in your book. The knock on the door would be the delivery man. And one time the station decided to play a joke on Soupy. This is at lunchtime when the little kids knock on the door, you open it, and you can see it, but there was a totally naked woman.
Yes.
I wish you had that on tape.
There is a tape, and the kinescope, it's either, there's a little segment of that and that has her, because he was afraid that she was caught on camera. She's off camera, and I think they pulled that on him maybe in L.A. also, but it originated here first in Detroit, and they would do all sorts of, sometimes play tricks on him, like they would put vodka in his orange juice. And he'd be drinking orange juice and go like this, and try to stay in character. And, so there was a lot of that kind of spontaneous, what seemed like spontaneous humor going on, which was one of the, Thank you.
I have no idea what I did with my little black folder. It's probably over there. What's the last? Oh, May We Know Peace. Couple of reminders. Next week, I'll be speaking about the book that was designated as our book club book when we were kind of not here and not there, The Constitution of Truth by Jonathan Rauch, who was a secular and atheist Jew, by the way, and gay, I found out from reading the book. So maybe I wrote it, maybe I didn't. I didn't, but it's a really, I think it's a book for humanists about whether truth can be discovered anymore in our day. We have coming up after that Ron Aronson, who will be speaking about what happened to We're All in This Together. You may remember that from March 11th to the 12th at noon. We were all in this together, and then we weren't in it together anymore. So he'll talk about that with an academic look at social madness. And then we've got Passover already coming up soon, so please let us know if you're coming to the second Seder. We'll be in person. You won't have to watch Arthur and I do our Seder on YouTube from our living room. As much fun as it was celebrating with a camera, we would enjoy being with you much more. I also have a little bit of sad news I want to share with you, bittersweet. We will be at the end of, or in the middle of the summer, saying farewell to Ezra, who will be departing as our music director. He's done an outstanding job for us, and we're going to miss him quite a bit. So we should have someone in place by that time. We're already talking to a couple of people, and well, not so much talking as listening to a couple of people. And we know that the great music tradition of our congregation that Ezra has kept up, we hope it will remain in good hands. So thank you, Ezra, for everything. As always, thank you for tonight. Thank you, David Weeks, who volunteers out of his time, out of his life, his personal time, every week to come and stream this service. And it's not for an insignificant number of people. There are quite a few people that are watching. So I want to make sure that we all appreciate his volunteerism. And then we will conclude with May We Know Peace as we go on our way. Thank you again, Ezra, David, Arthur, for the slides, and to all of you, Shabbat Shalom. Oh, and especially Fran. Thank you.